Hello, and welcome to the Canadian Club of Ottawa's inaugural event, the 2021-22 season, The Business of Elections. My name is Jeff Turner. Before we begin, the Canadian Club of Ottawa first acknowledges that this event, watched in many regions of Canada, is occurring on Indigenous territory, and at a time where our path to reconciliation is difficult, but undoubtedly the most important issue that we face as a people on this land. And for where many of us gather today in Ottawa, we pay our respect to the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, who are the traditional guardians of this land, which remains unceded. Miigwech. As a member of the board of directors, it is my honor to welcome you and our special guests on behalf of my colleagues on the board, but especially our president, Awais Osman, and our vice president, Zina Sarurni, who did incredible work to bring us this event today. We are also grateful to our sponsors, Royal Bank of Canada, Shaw Communications as our corporate sponsors, and our gold sponsors, Welch LLP, Strategy Corps, and TD Bank. Our media partners for the 2021 virtual season are Impact Public Affairs, iPolitics, The Hill Times, and Ottawa Business Journal. A few housekeeping notes for you watching. If your internet quality is poor, please use the Click Here to Switch Stream button at the lower bandwidth. The video quality will reduce, but the audio will remain the same. If you're having other technical issues, click on the Request Help bubble at the bottom right corner of the webcast. Response will be emailed to the address you used to register. To ask a question, simply click on the Questions tab, type in your question, and click Submit. You may ask a question at any time during the webcast, and we will get to as many questions as possible in today's presentation. Now, about our event. Elections are important. Collectively, we are responsible for our destiny. What we see in elections, the clash of good intentions and hard problems, leadership contrasts and accumulated baggage, promises and avoidances, these are the imperfect substance from which we must make decisions. Today, the club is pleased to bring you deeply experienced views from a number of perspectives from our exceptional guests. Our goal for this plugged-in audience is to dive deeper than the news shows and water cooler talk and get to understand the workings and dynamics of an election from those deeply experienced in them. Your moderator today is Heather Bacon, a past president of the Canadian Club of Ottawa and the publisher and vice president at iPolitics.ca, an independent digital native parliamentary news service that covers the business of government. With her extensive experience in journalism and digital media and her keen following of the current and past elections, I will turn it over to you from here, Heather. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Jeff. I just want to make a slight correction on my name. It's Bakken, like the oil, but it's okay. That's a common misnomer. It's my pleasure to be here today to moderate the panel discussion with three distinguished public servants who have given their time, dedication, and commitment to Canada in a way that many of us dream to do. I would like to say that we're going to have, I think, a robust discussion. And as Jeff mentioned, we're kind of going to provide the undercurrents of what happens when you're campaigning, when you're governing, and what happens at the end of that service. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce Peggy Nash, who is a former NDP Member of Parliament for Parkdale High Park riding. She has served as the official opposition critic in the portfolios of finance and industry. Before her election in 2006, she was a senior labor negotiator with the Canadian Auto Workers, now known as Unifor, in the auto, transportation, and service sectors. She is currently the advisory chair for the Center for Labor Management Relations and a distinguished visiting professor at Ryerson University, one of my old alma maters, and she's also a board member of the Broadbent Institute. Adam Vaughan is a former Liberal MP for Spadina, Fort York, who served between 2014 and 2021. He also served 2 terms as a Toronto City Councillor, where he played a major role in reforming Toronto's public housing policy. Before entering politics, Mr. Vaughan was a broadcast journalist for more than 20 years, specializing in municipal affairs for both CBC and City TV, where he covered all 3 levels of government. And finally, the Honourable James Moore is a former Conservative MP for Port Moody, Westwood, Coquitlam, who served between 2000 and 2015. He was a Minister of Canadian Heritage and Official Languages and a Minister of Industry. Prior to entering Cabinet, he was the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Works and to the Minister for the Pacific Gateway and 2010 Olympics. That must have been an awesome job. He is also a former broadcaster and communications advisor. And after he left office, he became Chancellor of the University of Northern British Columbia. I believe that's your alma mater as well, and is currently a senior advisor at Denton's Government Public Affairs and Public Affairs Group. So thank you all for joining me today. We really appreciate your time and your dedication. Let's jump right in here and talk about the campaign. We've been in campaign mode in Canada since August the 15th when all the writs were issued. As veterans, can you describe what a campaign is like from a campaigner's viewpoint? Peggy, I'd like to start with you, please.
Well, my experience in campaigning is that it starts well before the writs drop. And if you think you have a shot at winning a seat, you want to be organizing, working, you've got your team assembled, you know where your office is going to be, you've planned your materials, you've planned your strategy for the campaign well ahead of time. I know for me, I always gave I've run 5 times in a riding that was a swing riding in downtown Toronto. So for a New Democrat to try to win a seat, you have to really have what I would call a running start. You can't just start day one of the official campaign. So what you're trying to do is make sure that you are known in the community, that you have some kind of profile, that you have a team assembled, both some people you can afford to pay in your campaign, but also really campaigns work with an army of volunteers. So you want to be inspiring people who want to get active in a campaign. And once the writ drops, then officially you can start putting your signs up. And we used to have some wicked sign wars in the West End of Toronto where you're trying to outsign the other parties. And you know, I can just say you build tremendous relationships with people, tremendous friendships. And it's one of the very good things that outlives official elected status or official campaigning is the friendships that you build. And some of those I think can be lifelong.
Oh, that's one of the things I hope we touch on. We talk about governing, Peggy, is those friendships and the lifelong connection as public servants. Adam, so you had one of those ridings in a well, it wasn't as much of a swing riding as it was in a in Toronto, where you were probably a very well-known person at the time. What was it like for you launching your campaign on the federal level?
Well, I had the opportunity and I think the experience of running without a party in 2 municipal campaigns, and Peggy talked about the relationships you build in politics that transcend partisanship, and I think those relationships paid off federally when I chose to run federally, and it probably gives me a bit of a different experience from the other 2 members of this panel, because I wasn't a Liberal before I joined the party to run. It was a kind of a unique experience, sort of moving from being a municipal campaigner into being a federal campaigner, because all of a sudden whole parts of your campaign were no longer part of your sort of sphere of influence, or you were being impacted by things that somebody might have said in Winnipeg or in Vancouver or in Halifax, and that was an interesting change. I think that politicians go through campaigns very differently than I think everybody else. You feel it in ways that I think are different. The having a door slammed in your face is different when you're the candidate than when you're a partisan. Having people, sort of jump across when you knock on a door, somebody to be a member of a different party, and they say, you know what, put up a sign, I like you, or I can't believe you're doing what you're doing. How dare you? You feel it emotionally, and I think it's wrong to pretend that you don't. On the other hand, I also think that when you're part of a party and part of a political structure that is now trying to win a campaign nationally, it's also interesting to see how you have to start checking your own language. I remember in the first by-election, the oil sands and tar sands were 2 very separate words, but they both meant the same thing to me. It was just a question of who you were talking to and how they referenced an issue like that. But I remember getting an email saying, so no, you can't call them tar sands, you have to call them oil sands. And it struck me as odd. What's the difference? Everyone knows what we're talking about. But it played differently in a by-election that was happening in Fort McMurray at exactly the same time. And we had two elections being played off against each other constantly between the downtown of Toronto and a rural Alberta riding. And so it was an interesting moment of learning how you had to at once take advantage of your unique capacities as a candidate, but at the same time sort of pull back and insert yourself into a national campaign for the first time. And I think that those two things were a little disorienting as someone who's I guess got a bit of an independent streak and always has had one. So that part of the campaign was interesting, and it's also very interesting to go from a campaign where you're going there to represent just your ward or your council district, and then going there to represent a national party as you campaign in your district. Are you representing the party to the people or the people to the party? And I think that those conversations are perhaps the most interesting conversations that happen in the campaign offices, but they also happen amongst you and your friends and your family in ways that are completely different. And I find that to be one of the more interesting components of what my experience in federal politics gave to me. And I'm someone who covered a lot of federal campaigns, so you'd think you'd seen it and known it. But when you're the person whose face is on the sign, it impacts you in a way that intellectually and spiritually is very, very different. And I found that to be a really interesting sort of experience insofar as the first couple of campaigns.
That is interesting. And I think I like what you just said about, viewing this from the outside. The three of you are insiders, and that's why your perspective is so valuable, because you really can't know until you're on the inside. James, I'd like to pivot to something that Adam touched on, and that is messaging from central party. So you're knocking on the door, and you had more of a rural riding. I spent much of my childhood next door in Maple Ridge, so I loved Poco, spent a lot of time there. It has a different sensibility than the major urban centers such as Toronto and more recently Vancouver. So how do you manage that when you're knocking on doors representing your constituents, and then you have a federal party that is controlling to a large part the messaging? How do you reconcile those two positions?
Well, it's different. It's sort of like what I know now versus what I knew as a young 24-year-old candidate when I first ran for office. My grad supervisor, when I told him I was running for office back when I first did in the year 2000, he did me a very solid piece of advice. He told me two things. He said, first, before you run, write a letter to yourself to center yourself about why you're running, what you hope to accomplish. And whenever you go through your dark moments, refer back to that letter and how you define success at the beginning, and what you write down what you think you will define success and feel accomplished and fulfillment in if you accomplish these things in your time in public life. First. Second thing he did is he handed me an article from the Canadian Journal of Political Science, which pointed out that 97.8% of Canadians vote the way they do in a national election based on party, leader, and issue. Less than 3% of Canadians, it's actually, I think the number is 2.4% of Canadians vote the way they do, with a heavy emphasis on the local candidate. People don't vote, people don't elect members of parliament. People choose prime ministers and governments. When you're a candidate knocking on doors, you think it's about you, and the voters think it's about them. And the voters are right. It's about them. And they only get one vote. And with that one vote, they get to send a message to the incumbent government going out, to vote for a government coming in, to make a statement about the current prime minister, to put down a marker on an issue that they think is the most important, to send a message about the status of things, to whether or not they're satisfied. They only get one shot to try to send multiple messages. And on that list of messages that they really care about, who your local member, frankly, if it's Adam Vaughan or James Moore or Peggy Nash or anybody else, we could all help you help you with your passport problem. We can all help you with your parents and their problems with CPP. Like your local member of parliament matters, I suppose, but it matters within the context of the much bigger conversation that's going on. And so to humble yourself and to recognize, so my grad supervisor, when he told me this, he said, so therefore, James, know that if you win, it's not about you. Don't let your head get big. It's not about you. There's a much bigger thing going on, and the demographics of your riding, the nature of the historic voting patterns, all these other things are at play. Your personal role in it is miniature. So it's not about you, and don't let your head get big. And the inverse is true. If you're not successful, it's not about you. The public didn't reject you. They didn't dislike you. Most of the public just assumes that the NDP and the Liberals and the Conservatives, that they have some kind of a process that churns out and provides the public with a credible candidate to represent the party in Parliament. So they just kind of surrender that. So if you're not successful, the public didn't look you and think that, my God, this guy's not qualified, or he's not a good guy, or I'm making a judgment about his character, because that's not what happened. So don't let your head get too big, and don't get depressed on the way out. Know that. Take what you're doing seriously, but don't take yourself seriously. And I held that perception of things all through my political experience.
That's incredibly valuable. I'm going to pin that one for good. Peggy, could you speak to that with an anecdote as well? Because, I think in most of the ridings that 3 out of 4 people or more are not going to win. And you've had the distinction of really fighting back in a riding where you owned it and then you lost it. So do you have any advice or anecdotes that speak to that issue?
Sure. I'd like to actually comment on both the other speakers. When Adam ran, he was well known as a reporter, but when I ran, it was later in my career. I was well known in the field that I had chosen, which was the labor movement, fighting for workers' rights, but I wasn't necessarily a household name in Parkdale High Park in Toronto. So I had to really work to kind of build up my profile. But I'll tell you, the day that the election was called and those signs go up, those great big signs, and your picture is on there, it's a bracing feeling. It's like, my reaction was, oh my God, I'm out there. It's like I have jumped off this cliff and I cannot go backwards now. So it's a very strange feeling, because we're all, if you're an extrovert, introvert, whatever, we all are private people to some degree. And suddenly you are a public figure. And I don't know if that happens, James, when you're 24, if it's different than if it happens in your 50s, when it happened to me. But I found it very bracing, and I found it challenging to start talking to people at the doorstep. I was almost shy to ask them to support me. Well, you get past that pretty quickly. By the end of the campaign, it's vote for me, right? You very quickly want to, people. I at first wanted to have conversations at the doorstep, and people who had been through more campaigns, because I was a New Democrat supporter, but I wasn't a party insider really. And people said to me, when you have a 20-minute conversation with someone who may or may not vote for you, it's maybe 5 or 10 other people that you don't get to speak with who might support you if they actually got to look you in the eye. So you learn to be more efficient, that is for sure. But I really appreciated James's comments about, both his comments about write yourself that letter. It's what I advise people who want to be candidates who come to me. I say, write yourself a letter. It's not the letter that you're putting out to your constituents, but it's to yourself why you're running. And it might be the same thing. I'm not saying you're trying to be duplicitous to your constituents, but it's a personal commitment. And there will be great days in politics, and there will be devastating days. And just reminding yourself why you got into this. I think that's excellent advice. And I also appreciate the advice about not getting too invested. The first campaign, I've run 5 times, and I ran in a leadership campaign, and believe me, I've lost more than I've won. It's way better to win, let me tell you. But the first campaign that I ran in, it looked like we were going to win. And most candidates obviously don't win, especially the first time. And it looked like we were going to win, and everybody was talking like we were going to win. And I didn't understand how things can shift in the last week or so of a campaign. And that's why I find this particular campaign now very interesting. But election night, my campaign manager said, where do you want to be in election night? And I said, well, this is a campaign where we've been with our volunteers and with people. I want to be with my team. So I'm in the celebration hall watching the results come in. It was my birthday. My parents are there, and I'm seeing the results come in. Lost the poll. And it was like death by 1,000 cuts. And my manager pulled me into a little stairwell in the facility we were in. And he said, Peggy, I have to tell you, I'm the bearer of bad news. Tonight is not your night. And it was like, oh, okay, back in there and give a rousing speech. And what I said to people was, we didn't lose, we just didn't win yet. And it's James's point about separating yourself from the campaign, from a win or lose. There are so many factors. And keeping your team together, inspiring people, and you just have to kind of suck it up and keep going. And people forget you're a real person and you feel these things emotionally when you win or when you lose. The euphoria in 2011, the euphoria of us winning so many seats, and Jack named me opposition finance critic. That was a really good time. Sadly, then Jack died right afterwards. So politics is emotional. It's an emotional roller coaster, and you can't let yourself determine your self-worth by the fickle nature of politics.
It's funny, you talk about the letter that you write. I was asked to do the same thing when I decided to run the first time. And I've been packing up my Ottawa office. And I'm in Ottawa today. And I came across the notes I got back from Deanne Taylor, who was the Hummer Sisters, or the Video Cabaret. She's she was until she passed away just this last year, very prominent playwright in Toronto, who was also very engaged politically across a whole series of provinces and countries and histories. And I read the notes that she wrote back to me on what I had written, and it was not so much that the message and the core of what I'd written was off base. She wasn't editing the content. She was translating it from a conversation with myself into a conversation with the public, and how to just change a word here and a word there to make the message that you're sending to yourself, which is incredibly personal and very intense at times, into a palatable message, or a message that communicated better with the wider public. And it's a practice when folks come to my office, and I'm sure both of you have had the experience of people who have thought about running, where I often say, go write an essay as to why it's got to be you on the floor of Parliament, or you on the floor of City Council, why it's got to be you in that moment in time that has to have the decision as to whether to say yes or no, or I'm in or I'm out on a particular issue, and then boil it down to a paragraph, and then boil it down to a sentence, so that you've got a focus around your campaign. Because as Peggy said, you do have 30 seconds at the door sometimes you have 5 minutes, and sometimes you have 20 minutes, but you'd better be able to communicate your core values and what you add to the political process in that time. And I think it'd be a fascinating book to take a look at James's letter and Peggy's letter and my letter and 15 other politicians, to see where they veered and where they stayed true, and what the implications of veering and staying true were. Because I think that there is a core sort of moment in time. There's a point where you decide to flip the switch and become a candidate as opposed to a political activist. And then there's a time, as David Miller once said to me, he said, the hardest decision you make is not to run, it's when to stop. And there's also a decision as to when to pull away. And that would equally be an interesting letter as to why you suddenly said, now's the time. It's time for someone else, or it's time for me to stop. And that would be an interesting letter as well.
Gerald Ford once said about getting in and out of politics, he said, getting in and out of politics is like a hammock. When you're not in it, it looks like a really good idea. When you're in it, it's really kind of nice to be there, but it's very difficult to exit gracefully.
Especially him.
Well, you've got the title of the book for all your letters. Let's call them
the hammock.
Hammock.
Yeah. So just moving from the personal experience to broader, all of you have mentioned being a part of a team as well. So what is the relationship between you as a candidate and the Electoral District Association? Who would like to take that?
Jeez. That's a mic.
I don't mind jumping in. I mean,
Peggy,
some people run in an electoral district where there's really not much organization, where they're kind of building it from the ground up. In my area, we had an executive, we had a number of activists, but I think most candidates, when they want to run, you're trying to win support from the existing people that are there, but everybody, in my experience, wants to bring in their team as well. I think it works best when you can combine the existing leadership in a district with some new blood and some new energy and new ideas. But I tried not to just clean house and turf out the ones who were there, because even if maybe that were possible, and I know some people do that, but there is history embedded in the executive that is there, even if they have not been successful recently in electing people. They know, oh yeah, that's Mrs. So-and-so over on Dury Avenue, and she's always a key donor, or that's Jacob over on that street, and he's not on the executive, but he's been a good activist. They've got that history embedded in them. What is challenging is when you want to try to do things differently, and I think a lot of some candidates might just surrender to the established people in the electoral district and say, I'm the candidate now, and presumably you've been elected by the membership, and you just put yourself in their hands and they take over. But when I ran, we had not been successful, and so I thought I had some new ideas that would help us win, and ultimately we did. But I tried to be very careful to work with the established group there, and I found their history, and just trying to be respectful of what they brought to a campaign that I felt served me well.
That's they say all politics is local, and I think if you're dealing with the community and then the broader national campaign, that sounds like a perfect recipe to somehow find the way forwid.
Something I will just say is that we didn't always kind of take the message from the national campaign. We took pride in saying we would run our local campaign. So especially the first couple of campaigns when Jack was leader, like I first ran when Jack Layton was the new leader. And I was kind of surprised that he didn't emphasize urban politics as much as I thought he would. But I think he was trying to establish himself as not just a downtown Toronto guy. He wanted to, he's got to pitch to a whole country. But we kind of prided ourselves on saying, well, we're going to take that standard leaflet that the party is telling us we should put out, and we're not doing that. We're gonna do our own little Parkdale High Park leaflet. So we did that on a few occasions. We like to feel at least that we were feisty and independent.
It's interesting that phrase "all politics is local" comes from Tip O'Neill, and I think in the American system, where you have effectively a two-party system, and it's in some parts of the states, it's harder to win the nomination than it is to win the election, and there's some writings like that in Canada as well. But I think that what I find interesting about the riding association and the party establishment, because don't forget I walked into it and walked into it sort of as a bit of a surprise, and that rubs some people's noses the wrong way. Being a sort of identified as a star candidate, not a parachute candidate, but perhaps a star candidate running off the city council. You're managing the campaign office sometimes as much as you're managing head office. And that's one of the roles that candidates sometimes have to play, to the detriment of their campaign quite often. But I think that I read a book a long time ago by an Italian philosopher, a political writer, Elias Canetti, called Crowds and Power. And it talked about how you open the doors to a party tent. Political movements that sort of close ranks start to shrink. People leave the tent, but no one gets in. And parties that open up the tent can't really keep track of who's coming and who's going, and there's a bit of a risk to that as well. And I think that managing the party and managing the campaign are two components of political life that I didn't have to deal with as much at City Hall, because you're managing your ward as much as anything else, and you've got a big tent politic delivered to you because you've got so many competing interests within electric boundary. But getting inside the party was interesting to watch how the party behind, when the tent doors do close, how the party manages itself was fascinating to watch. As a political reporter, it's the one part of politics you really don't have a clear line of vision to. The caucus doors are locked. The party organizing is done within trusted circles. And it was interesting for me as a political reporter, as a political sort of, I guess someone who's been around politics without being necessarily in politics, to watch that process unfold. And I think it was one of the things that you think Ottawa a little bit as someone who's been up on the Hill covering it, has been through a few campaigns and leadership campaigns, and you're sort of getting pretty good at guessing who's going to win and why and how. But watching the internal politics of a party for the first time while you're joining it was to me fascinating. And it's a much more dynamic and a much more confrontational space than you think it is. But it also, the peacemakers within the party played an extraordinary role at holding it all together. And I found that to be fascinating on the inside. It was almost like you wished you could jump on camera and say, guess what I just found out. But you can't do that when you're part of a party, because you got to be loyal to the party. Because if you start to stray, if you start to sort of to move too far away from the core message of head office, you do start to cause problems for other people in other parts of the country, and you've got to be responsible to that. And that's one of the things that was a learning curve for me when I jumped from City Hall to Parliament.
James, what's your sense of that? Because when your government swept into power, accountability was a very important kind of campaign message. So you're, having come in and starting from scratch, you would have seen how the managing the party versus managing the campaign shaped up, and the contrast between that up close. And also, I think it's fair to say that you took some pretty brave moves in some of your votes as a member of Parliament. I'm thinking in particular the one on civil unions. Can you speak to what Adam was talking about with that contrast between managing the campaign and managing a party that actually has power and is governing?
Yeah, I mean, there are two very different worlds that kind of don't collide, right? Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you about the gay marriage issue. So when I first ran for office, I just turned 24. There was a woman who had lost the nomination in a by-election that we'd lost to the Liberals. So my riding was Conservative in like 84, 88 went NDP over Free Trade by a small margin, Reform 93, Reform 97. In a by-election, the Liberals won at 36, 33%. And then so in the next election, we should come back because Liberals were on the decline at that point. So we should win it. So the woman who lost the by-election nomination was then going to be the candidate for the general in 2000. I came in as a 24-year-old out of nowhere, signed up all my hockey buddies and college and high school friends, and took the nomination. And the board was not very happy with that. So we had a 30-person board. Out of a 30-person board, I think I had 5 supporting me. Everybody else was on her side. So I was nominated 6 days into the writ. So I only had 29 days left of campaigning and $2,500. So we went out, we raised 80 grand. It was like so I basically went to every member of the board who didn't support me. And I said, look, please come to our campaign office opening. Bygones be bygones, let's get on board. Let's all move together. I gave them one shot, and then I just said, that's fine. And then after the election, we replaced all of them because it was a George W. Bush moment. You're with me or you're against me. We're in the middle of a war here, and we got to move forward. And I don't have time for old problems. I was democratically elected. We're moving forward. I'm not angry about it. I'm just moving forward. On the issue of gay marriage, what happened then was, so in the spring of 2005, there was the vote on Bill C-38, if memory serves, the Civil Marriage Act put forward by then Justice Minister Irwin Cotler. And I knew very early on that I supported and believed in same-sex marriage. There were, at that point, Belinda Stronach had crossed the floor to the Liberals. So there were 3 out of 99 Conservatives who voted in favor of gay marriage. Myself, Gerald Keddy from Nova Scotia, Jim Prentice from Calgary. I was the first person to come out and say I was in favor of same-sex marriage. That didn't go over well. You know, I had members of the caucus, you know, again, the Conservative Party was at that point, you know, militantly, Stephen Harper was stridently opposed to same-sex marriage. You know, everything has flipped. It's been a remarkable shift in society in all the right ways. But I just knew demographically, I knew, first of all, intellectually, morally, it was the right thing to do. Legally, it was the right thing to do, and it was the right. And I couldn't understand the arguments on the other side, like just practically, substantively, morally, I didn't get it. Like I didn't get it, and so now it had consequences. So my board, I had 3 or 4 members of my board resign on the spots when I said that I was voting in favor of gay marriage. One of whom ran against me as an independent and took, I think, 8 or 10% of the vote in the subsequent campaign. I had everybody threatening me that they were going to run against me for the nomination. And one of the most glorious, it's funny, and as a politician, one of my most favorite memories in politics was telling somebody I didn't want their vote, which is not how it's supposed to be, but we have those moments. I remember door knocking in Port Coquitlam, and I remember exactly. And I drive by the house every now and then, and this guy, he said, James Moore, I've been hoping to talk to you. I'm glad you knocked on my door. Can you come in? I stood in his foyer, and I walked in, and he sort of positioned me where I kind of couldn't escape, so he could launch into me. And he said, I'm meaning to talk to you. He said, you know what? You're voting for, you're not a real conservative. You don't represent this community. I can't believe you supported homosexual marriage. And he just launched into me. And I said, I want you to know you will never have my vote, and I will never support you. And I will tell everybody that you should never be, you're a disgrace. And I just paused for a second, and I thought, so you're never going to vote for me? And he said, yeah. And I said, good. Well, just so you know, I don't want your fucking vote. And if you ever voted for me, I would consider, I said, if you ever voted for me, I would consider it an absolute disgrace. I said, you're a fucking disgrace. Now let me get out of your house. And I left, and that was it. And
bravo.
It was just a demarcation point.
And you won without his vote.
I won without his vote. But there are those moments, right? Because in politics, like, you could disagree with somebody on 90 issues. You try to find the one thing that you agree on and just kind of revert back to that. It's that bridge of just maybe they'll vote for you. And at a certain point, you're just like, you know what? You're just wrong. You're just wrong. And I don't want your goddamn vote. It's not worth it. And that was one of those moments.
Could I just offer just a slightly alternative view of that? But I mean, I have had people who have made like overtly racist statements, and yeah, it's just, okay, goodbye. I don't want to talk to you. But I also had the experience of going to a house, and it turned out that although he wasn't there, I knew the person a guy who lived there, but I hadn't looked at the list or anything. I just knocked on the door, and a woman answered, and introduced myself. And she says, I don't think you're going to be very happy with, I asked her, I think, what's your key issue? And she said, I don't think you're going to be very happy with my issue. And I said, well, try me. And she said, well, I believe life begins at conception. And she kind of stopped and looked at me, and I said, well, I can understand how strongly you hold that view, have a different view, but I understand it's something that you care very deeply about. And she kind of sighed, and we went on and talked about a number of things. And I heard back from someone else in that household that she was shocked. She thought, I don't know what she thought. I was going to yell at her or condemn her. And the whole household ended up supporting me and putting signs up. And actually, I think they donated. And I mean, I learned through knocking on a lot of doors, and people have a lot of different views. I'm very strongly pro-choice, but I also, not wanting, certainly not tolerating racism or homophobia, understanding that people come from different perspectives, and sometimes it's a deal breaker for them, but sometimes it's a strongly held issue, but it's not a vote determining issue. So I don't know, maybe that sounds super wishy-washy, but no, it's just my experience.
You often get told by your campaign team, don't knock on that door, they've got a sign up. And I said, well, that's one voter in the house. Maybe it's not all of them. But I also think if I'm going to represent the riding, I've got to talk to the opposition voting members of the riding as well. And I think sometimes when, as a candidate, it's harder to do it perhaps when you're a canvasser, but when they actually see your principles in play and they understand how you compose that and how that impacts, you talked about same-sex marriage, but that can also be translated to a whole series of other values around human rights. When they see that you're prepared to sit there and have a conversation about your principles rather than an argument, you can pick up votes and flip the color of the sign pretty quickly on the front lawn. I used to have fun flipping those signs. It was kind of sport almost after a while. But I think on the other side of it is that sometimes, and I think we're seeing it more and more, and certainly in this election with some of the behavior, that people are digging in a little harder on some stuff. And I think it's perhaps the COVID experience has laid bare some of the how close people are to the edge on a whole series of issues for a whole series of reasons. And I think you lose something when it becomes an argument instead of a conversation. And I think politics and parliament and democracy is threatened when you can just mail in your vote and everybody's tried and true to party brand or to party position. I think Canadians, on a whole, would rather have a conversation about politics than an argument. And I think that politicians actually would rather have a conversation about policy than staking out sort of some of the issues the way they're staked out and the way it's do or die, this way or that way. I often said I think the most disappointing thing is the collapse of collaboration in politics. At city council, you can't afford to piss off your seatmate because you might need the vote on the next issue, and a collegiality starts to be birthed from that. I've seen it on committees. I've worked across party lines to get good policy evolved and try to get better recommendations, and hopefully the committee report creates a political context for cabinet to do better things and that sort of stuff. But I think when we reduce it to ideological or to hard positions and we insist on an argument and a winner take all dynamic, I think we lose the creative space that collaboration can sometimes bring to politics. And I think that when we do that as politicians, we do ourselves a disservice as much as we do the public a disservice. And I sometimes you have to do what James did, which is simply say, sorry, I disagree with you and I don't want your vote. But I also think that there are times when you say, well, so what else are you interested in? Because maybe there's common ground somewhere else. And always looking for the battleground means that the common ground is never there. And if you can't find the common ground, you will never find higher ground. And I think that we need to take a step back sometimes and look at it from that perspective. And maybe it's easier to do it on the way out the door than on the way in. But I think that was the lesson from City Council that I was taught, and I hope that if we're heading to another minority parliament, I hope that the collaborative side of it kicks in more, because the last 6 months was so toxic on so many other, and everybody had a hand in it, but it wasn't productive. And I think that it does a disservice to the needs of Canadians when one side is always right and one side's always wrong, and you can't have a conversation.
I think one of where you can actually see that play out for people who are in your position and serving in Parliament is time allocation for debates. I mean, some of these mechanisms that were put in place to protect Parliament have been weaponized. And, I think Samara Institute of Democracy did a survey, and under the Harper government, the time allocation was used more than any other government in the history of Canada by a factor of like 10x or something. And then the Liberals came in and said, we're not going to, use those shenanigans. And they are better, but they are the second worst offenders in the history of our country. So that kind of leads me to. But that's
can I just say about that, by the way? That's an entire. I like it's an entirely reasonable criticism given. However, when we have a 338 seat House, and we're physically running out of room, and we're going to add more members of Parliament over time, time allocation it gets stigmatized. It's an entirely reasonable tool in a parliamentary democracy. We should absolutely, in my view, follow the UK and the UK model. They negotiate amongst the parties and they say, we're going to have, for example, legislation on decriminalizing marijuana. And they said, so we think it's appropriate to have, as a government, 18 hours of debate on this, and it would be allocated proportionally based on seats in Parliament and seats on Parliament. So the Labour Party, you'll get 7 speakers, as the government will get 12 speakers, et cetera, et cetera. And you say, is that reasonable? Like, are 9 speeches over 12 hours, is that enough time for you to get your position out there and known by the public, get your clips on social media, and to stand your ground and make your position, offer your amendments? Like, if that's not enough time, you're pretty bloody inefficient. But Parliament has to do stuff. And the time allocation gets stigmatized as a weapon for being anti-democratic. Well, putting up endless reams of speakers to rag the puck and not actually do anything, that's equally as undemocratic. There is a middle ground, and the UK Parliament shows us how to do it.
I mean, look, at time allocation feels bad, and at times when you're dealing with really complex and deeply divisive issues, it is bad. But the other side of the criticism, you use time allocation all the time. It's well, look how you've only gotten 4 pieces of legislation through. I mean, the opposition's job is to oppose, but is it to stop? I mean, if the democratic will of the House, if the votes are there to pass a motion, is 36 hours of voting really productive? No, of course it's not. But I understand the point that's being made, and I understand the game that's being played, and the inside baseball of it all drives everybody to distraction. But I think the reality is that I think Australia's got a good model where they have 2 chambers. And if you want to talk to your heart's content about an issue, you go to the second chamber and you get your moment in a parliament, and you get to get on the record and put it into Hansard without slowing down the decision that's going to be made, because 9 times out of 10, you're voting the way the House leader's telling you to anyways. They're very rarely do you see somebody stand up and say, I need to speak on this because I'm breaking from my party. It's almost always,
let me just offer one other.
I'm in favor of what my party's doing, and that to me is a little disingenuous.
And that's the difference between Westminster and what we have in Canada as well, right? Like there are a lot of talking points, and you've got to pull in and fall in. Peggy's, yes.
Yeah, I was just going to offer another point. I think both Adam and James have made absolutely valid points. Time is one of the most valuable commodities in politics, as it is in media. So you want to use it wisely. But I will say, when I was opposition finance critic, the Conservatives brought in very large omnibus budget bills that included not just budget measures, but a whole whack of other things, reforming the RCMP and a whole bunch of other pieces, employment equity. And we had meetings in committee around the clock, and it was not a good process. Now, I mean, the Liberals have also brought in omnibus budget bills, and so these can be complex things. I agree with the need to use the time on behalf of Canadians as wisely as possible in our parliaments. And then Samara dissects all of these pieces, what works, what doesn't work, but sometimes it gets complex when bills are grouped together, really intentionally, as a way to kind of sidestep detailed public scrutiny. So I think there's a variety of ways of looking at the issue of time in Parliament.
But I hear you, and I remember I phoned up Peter Russell, who's an esteemed scholar of constitutional parliamentary practice, on our first budget bill. And I said, is this an omnibus bill? I hear the criticism, but I also am looking at it from a legislative agenda perspective, where we got to get A, B, C, D, and E done. And a budget has A, B, and C, D in it. And you're going to have a budget implementation bill that's got A, B, and C, and D, making the legislative changes that are required to bring the idea to life. And he said, well, the question then is it all a budgetary item, or is it a regulatory change you're making? And then you add ordering councils and all those things to it. There's something.
So there's
something dysfunctional about the way in which we structure the House that forbids us from prying these things apart in an effective and efficient way, because the budget has to pass as a budget. Yeah. And so, of course, if you've got 17 spending items, you're going to have 17 pieces of legislation attached to a budget implementation bill. There's no other way of doing it. Where I think that the reform is needed, one, I think the Australian model does work. I think it does give you a chance to have your say and to explain to voters why you're supporting a very difficult piece of legislation. But I think the other part of it is, and I think this is where the opposition has a point, is that you come up with an idea that's startling or bold or unexpected, or moves very quickly in a very unexpected way, and it takes time for the Canadian body politic to catch on to what's really what really might be the implications of this, or what might be being changed or lost as a result of a piece of legislation. And that's why the opposition delays, to try and get the body politic to catch up to Parliament a little bit. And I think on those points, there's absolute value in trying to sort of slow it down and understand it and work with it. But it's got to come to a conclusion. And I think that that's the piece that's missing, is that so often you hear, how many speakers do you want? And the answer from the other side is, we'll tell you when we're finished. And that, to me, is the dishonest part of the sort of the omnibus bill conversation, is if you could have an honest conversation as to how long do you think you need to talk about this before we move to voting, you'd get to voting in a way without time allocation, and you would sharpen the point your party is making or the members are making. And do you have to have 42 people speak to it, or could you live with 32? And I think that's the honest conversation that doesn't happen in public, and it happens in the House leaders' offices, and that is a whole other part of the world that I'm glad I don't have to deal with anymore.
That's very deep insider. So all three of you would have been able to craft policy on the committee side, and that's more on the influence. And Peggy, you had mentioned that you were a witness, you provided witness testimony before you became a member of Parliament. Could I just get in a minute each how each of you feel the role of committee and crafting policy either fulfilled you or didn't fulfill you, and if anything has changed on that front? I know, and the other thing I will add for people who don't, you're looking at polling and seeing a lot of people are accusing Justin Trudeau of calling an election because he was riding high in the campaign polls. But there was also there were a lot of issues at the committee level that were more, let's just say, complicated with a minority government. So before we head into that territory, could each of you just share a little bit on policy making at the committee level? Because I think that's something that a lot of people in the audience don't really have a firm grasp on, and it may help them understand things better. James?
Yeah, probably the most successful example of policy on the committee level was after the 2006 election, when we did the Federal Accountability Act. And there was genuine collaboration, I think, certainly amongst the Liberals, or amongst the New Democrats, Conservatives, Bloc Québécois, and I think Liberals who wanted to get the sponsorship and the sense of the sponsorship behind them, and who genuinely understood that there was a sense that faith in government had been cracked as a consequence over the sponsorship scandal and what it meant going forward. And we were deeply delayed as a country. It's a sin of the blue and red teams both in government that a lot of things, from lobbying reform, the distance that's necessary, post politics and all that, from decision making, accountability, arm's length, all that stuff needed to be addressed and reformed. And I think there was, if you want to see a case study, that Federal Accountability Act was, I think, a good test. And I remember going through clause by clause. I was on that committee, going through clause by clause on it, and like genuinely, taking in amendments and working back and forth. Charlie Angus was the lead for the NDP at the time, and he and John Baird, Pierre Poilievre, myself, others, like that was genuinely like legislating on the go and getting into the gritty of amending legislation.
Peggy, what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's very different in a minority government than in a majority government. My experience as vice chair of the Finance Committee was, and we had an excellent Conservative chair in James Rajat. He was excellent in terms of making sure that things were fair and everybody got heard, but not much moved that the government didn't want to have move in the majority government. In a minority government, I remember being the lone New Democrat on the industry committee when Jim Prentice was the minister. Again, I thought he was a very good minister, and there was an issue about the sale of a Canadian company, McDonnell Detweiler, that makes space robotics and the Canadarm. And they were going, a person who worked there alerted me that they were going to be sold to an American munitions manufacturer. And so I led a motion to have a review of the sale. And really mounted a pretty effective opposition to it, because we were convinced that the jobs, even though they were saying the jobs would stay in Canada, that in fact those jobs would move to the States. And without getting into all the weeds, ultimately the minister decided to block that sale. And it was the first time, if I recall, under the federal legislation that a takeover like that was stopped. And I think it was because we were able to make the case. We had hearings, we called witnesses, and the minister made, I think, the right decision. And it was not where he was going to go initially. So I think in a minority, you have more leverage and more opportunities to influence policy. And I think having good people in leadership positions, I've mentioned 2 ministers who, I think we're flexible enough to make decisions that were helpful.
We had a
sorry, Adam.
we had a really interesting session around urban Indigenous housing, and I think we actually reached consensus amongst all the parties. Well, the Bloc was a little curious on some of the points, but and it was not so much to propel the government to act, because I think we're in the process of realizing that important policy piece, but it was to create consensus amongst parliamentarians that their party leadership shouldn't fight about this. And this was actually something which we could all actually do together, and it would work if and so you created it's kind of like sort of the way I'm a cricket player, so it's a bowler and a wicket keeper, but a baseball pitcher and a catcher, they need to know that the curveball is coming so they can catch it. And I think that sometimes parliamentary committees can create a context for governments to act in a collaborative way, and I think that is not as widely seen in public as it should be. But I'll give you an example of where I think that Parliament has changed in the last 5 years in a way that I think I'm not a big fan of the Senate. I'm not a big fan of appointed politicians. I'm not going to change the Constitution. I'm not going to have that conversation. But the Senate has become a almost like a standing royal commission on some issues. And the issue that I think that defines that is the medical assistance in dying legislation that has been returned to us by the Senate. We all kind of know there's a problem, and we can't quite get to a solution from a parliamentary perspective, because we're kind of dug in on some lines on that. It's an issue not unlike same-sex marriage in that regard. And as people start to see more medical assistance in dying play out in their lives, they become more comfortable with it as a concept, and it's less and less controversial. But the Senate has led Parliament in a conversation on that's seen a back and forth between the 2 houses that I don't think there's much precedent for, that's improved the legislation each and every time it's happened. And I think those sorts of things are glimmers of hope that conversation that I spoke to earlier is possible in the parliamentary precinct, but it requires leaders who are capable of taking credit for collaboration rather than just take responsibility for winning. And I think that's a change that may take hold, but we'll see what happens with the Senate. We'll see what happens with committees after the next election.
Okay, so we have another question from the audience. Can you please speak to the civility in election campaigns with a culture of partisanship? And what are the principles you adhere by and recommend? Who would like to take that?
Well, I'll just jump in quickly. I mean, you don't really get partisanship until you've run in an election campaign. I don't think partisanship is necessary. People see it as a bad word or negative. I would argue it is a route into politics. And if I think parties need to be more open, Adam mentioned this earlier, bringing people in, but it's like your team. You are fighting for your team. But I think we've all mentioned it can't be personal. It's got to abide by the rules, but it is a competition, and you want to compete as strongly as you can to win that competition in a situation where you don't control a lot of the factors. And so I think what we're seeing with some of the demonstrations in this campaign is something that's bordering on a very negative, not bordering, I think it's crossed into a negative path that we really have to reject. But so anyway, I just think that you can't take it personally, and you also have to behave civilly.
So I'm going to jump in there because we have one more question I'd like you to answer. Well, one of you, and this is talking about that incivility and partisanship, and particularly the use of anonymous kind of surrogates on social media. So the question is, do you see a way to fix the problem of incivility in the political sphere while encouraging real open discussion and not taking away free speech rights? Who would like to take that?
Reflecting what Peggy said, when you have the honor and the privilege of being able to tour the country and go to other people's ridings, regardless of party stripe, and you see how smaller communities in particular, where you've got, I think of Atlantic Canada, where you've got ridings that flip back and forth, red, blue, or whatever the combination is. The communities have to live with themselves afterwards, and so the campaigns don't become quite as vitriolic, because at the end of the day, you're going to be at the same coffee shop or the same bar, your kids are going to be playing on the same team, or you're going to be in the same sort of social setting, and so you don't make it personal, because at the end of the day, it's a cousin or an aunt or a friend or a coworker that you're going to be sitting across the table from after the election, and you want to be able to have a conversation about how the garden's going or the crops are coming up. I think that one of the challenges we have, and I saw this in electoral reform, where everybody wanted electoral reform or didn't want it, couldn't move away from 338 seats. I think smaller ridings create civility. I think they create civility because you can't piss off people and win the vote. You've got to be sort of embracing of the community as opposed to just your votes in order to win. And I think that one of the missed opportunities in electoral reform, and one of the things I think that might have made it possible to be more to experiment with it, to see how we could get representative democracy better reflected in Parliament and better reflected in the policy that Parliament creates, would be to actually have 600, I mean, pick a number, but have many, many more smaller ridings, so that you can't ignore half your riding and still win. You've got to embrace the other half of the conversation.
And you really need time allocation.
But the same side of it, well, no, you do. You have to make an accommodation for that. But at the same time, you end up in a smaller room after the vote's over, and you really do have to work together to get the local hockey rink built or a community center, made accessible, or whatever the issue is that actually is driving the core of what the policy need of a community is. I think we keep as we grow the ratio of members to voters, and it becomes wider and wider and wider, and it becomes less and less personable and more mechanical, I think we invite that space for anonymous and vitriolic politic in, because at the end of the election, we don't sit around the table and say, okay, we all had a different discussion about climate change and a different discussion about immigration numbers, but at the end of the day, we also know that the small wharf in our community needs to be fixed, otherwise the fishers can't get out to sea safely. That conversation is lost. And so I think that if one of the things I used to say about electoral reform is make the riding smaller, make the relationship between the elected and the electors more intimate, and you will get a more intimate and a better parliament, because you can pull away from your party without collapsing the policy and speak for your members, or you can start to compose votes in a way that they do compose votes in large parliaments like they do in large assemblies like they do in the States. And so I think there's a way of getting to that, but I think that it's what needs to be reformed is not, you're not going to change social media. That horse has bolted the barn. But I do think you can change politics to make it more intimate, and therefore a more civil conversation, because at the end of the day, nobody behaves like, I remember, and look, I can be as partisan as the next person. I've thrown punches and got my elbows up, and I'm the guy who lost the teeth in the hockey game with the Conservatives. Trust me, I can fight in politics. I know that there are things there are things you fight for, but one of my constituents showed up at City Council one day when I was there and said, you don't talk to us in the community the way you talk to your opponents at City Hall. Why is that? And it was a point of reflection that I actually had to think about. And so, yeah, I can get carried away as be as partisan or as belligerent as the next person. But if you're going back to a corner where you've got 5 different people with 5 different political perspectives, you're going to behave differently in public and in private, and that's going to return the civility to politics.
Well, the one common thread I see in the 3 of you today as panelists is you all have a measure of that you all have or seem to be grounded in common sense and had that connection with your communities and served your constituents really well, served your party well, and served Canada well. So I'd like to leave on a final question, audience question, to leave us on a high note with you, James. And could you just share your most memorable moment on the campaign trail, bringing it back to community so we can leave with a smile on our face?
Oh, geez, on the spot.
Unless you don't have one.
Well, almost. There are lots of memorable moments. I said that negative one that I described was a negative one, but a positive one ultimately because it was.
That's why I want you to pivot to this. Yeah. Okay.
No, look, I certainly will say this about politics. You do meet the good, you meet the bad, you meet the ugly, you meet the great. And people who come up to you and are very hopeful that you will raise their issue and address things, and all that is important. I would just offer this. What Adam just described, by the way, is a perfectly reasonable response for somebody who is a city councilor who worked in a ward and saw the benefits of what he described. Reasonable proposal. I have kind of an alternative view, which is that I think we have too much politics in our lives. I think that as volunteerism has gone down, religiosity has gone down, community engagement has gone down, our sense of identity has gone down. Whether those things are good or bad or whatever, I think they're just sort of demographic facts that more and more people are investing their hopes, their dreams, their passions, their identity, their sense of their ethnic makeup, their belief in the future of the world. All of it is being dumped into politics and the expectations that people will agree with them and they will get the outcome that they need, that they have to build that wall, to kick out the Muslims or to fight for climate change, that everything is being invested in politics, and politics can't stand the weight of that. It's not meant to absorb all of that expectation of belonging, identity, purpose in life, community building, fixing the planet. Like, politics is not meant to hold all of that weight. And we're dumping all of it onto politics, and politics is cracking under the pressure because it's not meant to do all that. And that's the problem. And so you talk about the toxicity of trolls online. A lot of it is just trolls. A lot of it is crazy. Some of it is tactics, but a lot of it are people who are stuck in their basements without a sense of community, belonging, identity, and friends and associations. And they're dumping all of their sense of identity and belonging and outcome and purpose in life into politics. And it's too much. We don't need more politics. We don't need more politicians. We don't need more of it. We need to have a healthier balance in our lives and our communities. And because the system is breaking under the pressure of everything we're dumping onto it. And I think that is something we should think about as we come out of COVID and people being isolated for a year and a half from one another, and the toxicity that can spin out if we don't have good conversations about this. So I guess the high note is thank you for being part of that in your way of having a conversation about how do we live together. That's what politics is. How are we going to live together? We're going to live together. How are we going to do this in a thoughtful way?
I just have to jump in because I just want to say that, for me, the high point in politics is seeing people who maybe were in a basement or were isolated, who didn't have a purpose. Maybe they just retired. Maybe they just moved to the country or the community, and they took one step. Maybe they signed a petition, maybe they showed up at an event, maybe they answered an email, and they took one step, then another step, and they had the confidence to see themselves as actual political actors, and they became involved in a community of politics and involved in a movement for change. And I just, I've seen so many. I remember one mom coming to me and she said we had a lonely, isolated, gay son, and he has found a home and he has blossomed. And I've seen so many examples we all have of people who found community. And you make a good point, James. It can't be everything, but it can be something tangible where you do build human relationships. And, I love it when we were successful and people would run up to me, people I'd never seen before, and they'd say, we won. And I think that's, people have felt a sense of belonging that maybe they're missing in other aspects of their lives, but it does offer people that sense of community.
Well, I think that's the power of democracy, and it's a hope in the participation of people. So we have people voting right now as we are speaking today, and I hope on the 20th that everybody will empower themselves by using the power of the vote, because I think you brought it, the three of you brought it full circle. There's a power of governing, and then there's power of community, and we need to have those two to connect. So on that note, I'm going to hang up the hammock for this panel discussion. I'd like to thank the Honorable James Moore and Peggy Nash and Adam Vaughn for giving us your time and your insights into what it was like to serve Canada. Over to you, Jeff.
Thank you, Heather. And just from me as well, thank you to our guests for joining us today and sharing your time, but also, of course, your extensive experience. Wonderful anecdotes throughout that over an hour. I appreciate that we got some questions in as well from the audience. As I said at the top, today's event is made possible because of the generosity of our sponsors, RBC, Shaw Communications, Welch LLP, Strategy Corps, and TD Bank. And to all of you watching, thank you for your time and interest in this conversation. We hope you received valuable insights and enjoyed the event. We do this for you, so thank you for joining us today. The Canadian Club 2021-2022 season, we have lots of exciting events coming up, and we'll be letting you know about them soon. Of course, we do hope, like all of us in 2021, to be seeing you in person soon when it is safe to do so. But of course, we're going to wait until that is safe and healthy for everyone. All the best to you. Thank you for joining us again. Stay safe and healthy, everyone. Have a great weekend ahead.